Hello, my name is Paul Jenkins, Managing Director of UK Packaging Innovation Consultancy, ThePackHub. I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Wood from Emitwise, who is Carbon Account Lead. Tom, tell us a bit about yourself.
Thank you, Paul. So basically, I'm a sustainability and climate change expert at Emitwise. I joined the company only about 6 months ago, actually. But my background before joining Emitwise, I worked for about 15 years across environmental and sustainability consultancy, particularly for the last few years, really working with lots of companies and organizations to helping them to understand particularly their carbon emissions and put strategies and targets in place for how they can reduce those.
Okay, excellent. So tell me a little bit more about Emitwise and what you do and how you make things, how you improve the carbon footprint situation.
Sure. So Emitwise is a software company. Fundamentally, we're marrying together sort of innovation in the sort of software development space, but with carbon accounting expertise like myself and others in the team. So we're bringing those together to really sort of provide a sort of disruptive service to help customers with their carbon accounting and management. And fundamentally, that's all really about helping those customers to accelerate their shift to a net zero carbon world that we're all aiming for. Okay.
And you talk about a net carbon world. Are you seeing that growing in the demand for that changing? Because certainly, the COP26, we've seen a lot more attention in this area. Is that something that you're seeing more demand for your services consequently?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I'm sure you see, there's been a constant sort of ratcheting up of interest and pressure for within and beyond companies for them to take action on their carbon emissions in recent years. COP26 really accelerated that in the UK, but yeah, there's a huge uptick in demand from companies wanting to align themselves to the sort of trends in the market and what their stakeholders are asking of them. So their investors and their major customers as well, who are increasingly more and more asking for more ambition in this space and to be moving towards net zero.
Okay, and what type of industries are sort of reaching out to you?
So we work quite broadly across a range of industries, particularly around manufacturing, and so we've been doing lots of work in the packaging manufacturing sector, but also across transport, logistics. Quite broadly in FMCG supply chains, food and beverage companies, for example, and we're working with automotives, electronics, and even construction materials manufacturing at the moment. So it's really quite a mixture.
Okay, who are the type of people that would be you would be liaising within these companies? Would you be dealing with the packaging people, or is it sort of more supply chain, or who would they be?
So in terms of who we're liaising within the companies, often our principal point of contact is the sort of sustainability management team in the company. That's not to say that they're the only stakeholders in terms of when we start working with these companies. Very often there is board level interest in taking action in this space. So they will be part of the decision to come to us, Emitwise, or to take action on their emissions. And then within the organization, we require quite a broad range of data from companies in terms of in relation to the different sort of activities that they are undertaking, and particularly around their procurement as well of the different goods and services that they are purchasing. So we actually have to get data from quite a range of individual sort of data owners within these organizations, and typically they're very big global organizations spread across lots of locations. So it can be quite a challenge pulling together all of that data.
Okay, roughly, what is the process, and how long does it sort of take to sort of go from start to finish through this?
So I mean, fundamentally, the process is that we collect data in relation to carbon emissions generating activities that the company is undertaking. So that's everything from the electricity that they consume, through to natural gas and any other fuels for vehicles or machinery that they operate. But also I talk about procurement as a really significant part of companies' emissions that they don't necessarily understand. It can be much more complex. So we need to get data on what they're buying, all of the raw materials, absolutely everything that they're purchasing for the period of time that we're looking to report the emissions for. And that's right across sort of different goods and services.
Okay,
So I was going to say, so we collect all of that information from them and basically feed that into our software and use our sort of wraparound carbon accounting expertise from people like myself and in the team to ensure that the software is performing the correct calculations and generating the emissions results that the customer then needs for reporting or for engagement themselves. But I mean, really the power that we have at Emitwise is that we're using software. We've got software on our site, which means that the whole process is much more efficient and much more accurate than some of the sort of more traditional ways of doing carbon accountancy. So it speeds things up and just results in better outcomes for our customers.
Okay, and you say it speeds things up, and how long would it typically take to go through this sort of process?
Yeah, it's a good question. It can be quite variable depending on the customer, how complex and large they are. And certainly the first time that we work with a customer, it will normally take longer because that process of understanding their organization and getting all of that data from the different data owners can take longer, but we do target a sort of quarterly update cycle. So we're not just calculating our company's carbon emissions once per year for their annual reporting. We actually look to do it 4 times a year, which really turns carbon into a sort of a key metric that the business can be looking to manage and understand, and then indeed be trying to manage down in more or less real time.
So it's actually an ongoing iterative process with a client or customer. I guess would they have, once the process has initially been sort of created, would they have give themselves sort of benchmarks or targets to further improve or reduce their sort of carbon footprint, and then go back to you to see how they might sort of edge it forward or backwards?
Absolutely, yeah. So once they've got their first results, there's sort of baseline assessments. In some cases, they've already done a baseline assessment in the past and maybe even set their own target already. But otherwise, we will work with them on a sort of baseline assessment, and then they can look to set themselves targets, which is something that we can kind of work with them to support. But then absolutely, our software allows them to sort of track their performance. Each time that we go back to them with an update, they can track their performance of how they're performing against that target, and they can break that down in many ways and look at how different regions, different divisions of the company, different parts of the business, the extent to which they're on course to sort of follow that target. Okay,
so are their targets sort of quite self-imposed, or are they sort of a bit more of an industry benchmark, if you like, in terms of what they need to achieve?
I mean, there's been quite a shift on this in the last few years. So, only going a few years back, carbon reduction target setting tended to be quite sort of top down and not necessarily very well defined. So companies would sort of set a target based on what they thought was feasible, or maybe what their competitors were doing. But there's been a big shift in recent years towards what are called science-based targets, which is basically setting targets for carbon reduction that are aligned to the climate science and the sort of international agreements and scenarios that are in place for the extent of decarbonisation that the world really needs to achieve. So there's an organisation called the Sciencebased Targets Initiative, who really is sort of the increasingly seen as the sort of the gold standard of setting the processes, the approaches that major companies should be following for setting those targets for carbon reduction.
Okay, and the brands, are they quite public in terms of the results and what they're achieving? I mean, do they publicize and communicate what they're doing?
Again, yeah, can be quite variable in certain countries, jurisdictions. There's now mandatory reporting requirements. So, for example, here in the UK, where I'm based, the the largest companies in the UK are required mandatory reporting of at least some of their emissions to government. But almost more important than that, increasingly actually, is the quasi regulatory requirement to report carbon emissions that's actually imposed by other stakeholders. So I was talking before about investors and also customers that they're almost more demanding in terms of their requirements on companies these days for carbon reporting than regulation.
And what about the sort of standardization of carbon reporting? You know, is it easy to compare one company with another, maybe using a different process? I mean, how does that sort of work?
So yeah, it's a great question. We at Emitwise, we very much, our approach is aligned to what's called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is really probably the best known international framework for reporting of carbon emissions, and that divides a company's emissions, but in terms of their direct emissions, but also their indirect emissions throughout their value chain, including sort of upstream emissions, particularly in their supply chain of materials, and then downstream emissions in relation to the use and possibly the disposal of the products that they are producing. And that, yeah, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol puts in place a sort of standardized framework of categories of emissions that means that you can look at one company's emissions and they are comparable to another's.
Okay, brilliant. And I'm just sort of interested, when you've done this process with a particular customer, have they had to fundamentally change what they're doing? You know, has this sort of opened their eyes to some pretty fundamental things that they're doing wrong or that they need to change? It's interesting if Emitwise is actually sort of impacting on their sort of day-to-day operations.
I mean, I wouldn't say it tends to be fundamental things these days, because you know, companies are increasingly aware of particularly their sort of direct carbon emitting activities, such as their use of fuels, and for example, and maybe indirect emissions in relation to electricity and other energy that they purchase. So that's, you know, it's very common that companies have been understanding and managing that for some time now. What tends to be much less understood for them is the emissions in relation to their what we call their indirect scope 3 emissions, which is the really indirect emissions from I was talking about upstream and downstream, particularly emissions in their supply chain, for the emissions that are generated in producing all of the products, the goods and services that company is purchasing. So that's where really our approach is really spectacularly accurate and comprehensive in that area, in a way that it's been very difficult to do for most companies in the past. And that can be really eye-opening for companies. They can really suddenly be hit by the reality of, wow, the major source of emissions for them is actually in purchasing a particular raw material from a particular factory. And then, but the great news there is that then actually opens up new opportunities that they can consider of working with those suppliers to see what those suppliers can do to themselves be decarbonising, but also starts to open up opportunities for potentially shifting from one supplier to another who's able to offer the same product but with a lower carbon footprint, or even changing the design of the product, whatever the company is actually manufacturing, so that you use less materials, or maybe you use materials that actually have a lower carbon footprint.
Excellent, brilliant. And have you got any examples of the sort of results you've delivered for clients? You know, some sort of key examples maybe to share with me? I
mean, I suppose it's maybe still talking a little bit generically rather than sort of specific examples, sure. But I mean, really, as I say, the spectacular result that our customers tends to see is just giving them that vastly greater understanding of their full scopes emissions throughout their value chain, and really where the key hotspots are that they should be looking to take action on. And what we do really see is that we always hear this from our customers, is that they say that really helps them to communicate both internally, but also beyond the organization with their stakeholders, such as investors and customers, even with their own staff. And we often hear them saying how that's helped them to actually increase their revenue, so win new contracts or secure new sales, but then also cutting costs and gaining efficiencies through reducing fuel consumption where there's particular hotspots that our software throws up new insights in relation to a particular activity in one location is using much more electricity than another location, and that becomes a huge cost saving opportunity for them. So we hear a real wide range of benefits and the sort of the positive outcomes that come out of working with us.
It's brilliant, and it's the benefits are much broader than just the environment. It's it's about cost saving, it's about efficiency.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. The financial business case really stands up quite firmly, and I suppose that brings in another area that we often hear our customers talking about is working with us. It massively cuts the time and burden that they as an organization actually have to spend in doing these sorts of carbon calculations, because if you take it as a given that major companies are increasingly being forced to do this sort of carbon accounting, then they've either got to do that in-house themselves, which increasingly requires more and more staff doing very complex calculations, pulling together this data. And if you don't have software on your side and doing this, it can be a very burdensome, inefficient process and prone to serious inaccuracies as well. So we see really great results with our customers in terms of the time savings, and that allows the sustainability teams to actually concentrate on sustainability management rather than just pulling data together and doing calculations. They can actually work on addressing the results, looking at the emissions and how they can actually target reductions.
Brilliant, excellent, Tom. That was really, really interesting, and I certainly feel that in the 15 minutes or so we've been chatting, I know a tremendous amount more about your organisation and how you help companies with their environmental objectives. What's the best way for people to contact you?
Sure, so probably best to just go to our website, so emitwise.com, or there's details on there of how you can contact us as well, but probably our sort of central email address is contact@emitwise.com, so you can ping a general inquiries about anything you like there, and then that will get directed to the right people.
Brilliant, excellent. Tom Wood of Emitwise, thank you very much for your time, and thank you.
Thank you, cheers.